I am Kelsey Atwood, Tour and Public Program Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this author's talk. The Society of the Cincinnati is the nation's oldest private patriotic organization. George Washington and the officers of the Continental Army founded the society at the end of the Revolutionary War to perpetuate the memory and ideals of the American Revolution. The American Revolution Institute carries out the Society's public mission to promote knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, exhibitions and public programs, preservation, and providing resources to classrooms. America's First Veterans, the subject of our program this evening, is inspired by our current exhibition that bears the same name. Over 250,000 men served in the armed forces that won our independence, and those who survived became America's first veterans. Using 85 manuscripts, rare books, prints, broadsides, paintings, and other artifacts, America's First Veterans introduces the story of the men and some women who bore arms in the Revolutionary War. The book follows their fate in the 70 years after the war's end and traces the development of public sentiment that led to the first comprehensive military pensions in our history. This evening, we would like to thank Khaki International for their generous support of our exhibition and the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati for their generous and continued support of our public programming. And so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our speaker this evening. Jack Dwayne Warren Jr. is Executive Director of the Society of the Cincinnati and Founding Director of the Society's American Revolution Institute. Jack Warren is a native of Washington, D.C. He has served on the faculties of the University of Massachusetts and the University of Virginia, where he was an editor of the papers of George Washington. He joined the Society's staff in 2002 and has been Executive Director since 2004. He has been a leader in the preservation of historic places associated with Washington, including the site of Washington's home and the house where he lived during his visit to Barbados in 1751. He's been a consultant to the National Park Service and many other institutions, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Park Service, and Mount Vernon. And please join me in welcoming Jack Warren.
Thank you, Kelsey. This project is really not mine alone, and I would be remiss, and I don't want to be, if I didn't do full credit to our staff and to the generous donors who made it possible. It's based on collections. I'm really proud to say that the exhibition that the book is based on draws almost exclusively on collections of the Society of the Cincinnati collected over decades. And the exhibition and the book were made possible by the generous donors who supported the development of those collections, and by the skillful people who work for us in our library and our museum program. So whatever I've accomplished in writing this book is really on their shoulders. And it's been a pleasure. History writing for me, sort of two kinds of history writing. One is a kind of exhibition of real expertise. Somebody has spent years and years working on a particular subject, and the book that they write is a reflection of deep scholarship and intimate familiarity with the sources that they're working on. There's another kind. I know that kind sounds very good, and it is, and such books are really wonderful as they reach for definitive scholarship. But there's another kind that, at its best, I think that's what this book is, or what it was for me, which is it's the product of a journey, an expedition, a sort of Lewis and Clark expedition into the unknown. There isn't a lot of literature on the veterans of the American Revolution. Of course, there are famous veterans of the Revolution, George Washington. We all know what happens to George Washington after the Revolution. And there are other people who are veterans of the Revolution, like James Monroe. We don't think of Monroe typically as a Revolutionary War veteran, but he was. And we know a lot about their stories, but we don't know a lot about the veterans of the Revolution as a group. There hasn't been a lot of scholarly literature. That is, that first kind of history writing, people who've delved deeply into a subject for a long time. In fact, over the last 20 years or so, really the first time that a sort of self-conscious, deliberate group of scholars have begun to study the experience of veterans at all as a historical matter. And you know, several months ago, we had a wonderful panel discussion. I say several months ago, now it was over a year. Time flies during these pandemic, but over a year ago, we had this wonderful panel discussion with historians who've studied veterans of different generations, of World War II, World War I, the Civil War. But there are only a handful of monographs, serious scholarly monographs on the veterans of the American Revolution. And so exploring this subject is kind of an exploration in the unknown, which makes it fun. At least it makes it fun for the researcher and the writer. And particularly during a very difficult year for the country, I thought a lot as I was working on this book. I wish that people of all sorts could have come along with me. It's a kind of a metaphorical expedition, but in examining the experience of people who fought in the Revolution. You know, think of it with me sort of metaphorically, sort of going off into the unknown and interviewing people, because that's really what you're doing. History is a collection of individual stories of individual people who participated in whatever historical event you're interested in. You get to interview them. Of course, they're not living, and so what you're really doing is reading whatever they've left behind in the way of personal correspondence, statements, documents of various kinds, to find out why they did, what they thought about it, what their experiences were. And what you hope as a historian is that once you've done that, once you've delved deeply into the specific, you know, essentially interviewing one person after another, that patterns will emerge, and you'll begin to see some kind of collective experience that you can use to frame your story. That is a bigger narrative, the narratives of the veterans after the revolution. And it's a tricky thing because people participate in a war, the war ends, and you might think, well, they go their separate ways. And of the 250,000 people, men and women, who participated in the armed forces at some point during the American Revolution, well, they didn't have one experience. They had many, many experiences. But the historian's job is to find patterns. And in the end, there are important patterns, and that's what informs this book. But at its heart, I would like everybody to think of it as a book filled with stories about individual people. That is the people that I had a chance to meet as I was doing the research. And the first one is Joseph Winter. And Joseph Winter was a Pennsylvania veteran. Oh, here he is. And some of you who've had a chance to see the exhibition, America's First Veterans, have seen this painting already. It's the centerpiece of this exhibition, and for good reason. On the evening of December the 18th, 1829, a young Philadelphia portrait painter, is 33 years old, named John Nagle, went out to visit a friend, and it was snowing and a little bit sleeting that night. So he had to sort of pull his coat tight as he went through the streets of Philadelphia towards his friend's house. And he reached a point on the street, must have been, it's dark, it was in the evening, probably about the time it is now. And there probably wasn't anyone on the street. You can imagine it empty and dark. He comes up on a little makeshift shelter made out of planks and whatever else, sort of trash the man who was sheltering himself in it could find. And inside of this little makeshift shelter in the snow was this man, the man in this painting. And it was cold and snowing, and the man was elderly, and Nagle stopped and spoke to him. He wanted to make sure the man was all right. And it turned out that the man spoke only German, and so they couldn't speak to one another. Nagle didn't speak German, but Nagle was able to make himself understood enough to invite the man to come home with him, back a few blocks to Nagle's house. Nagle abandoned the plan to go visit his friend, and who must have scratched his head and wondered where Nagle was. There were no phones in those days. But Nagle took the man home and sat him down by his fire, and then went and got his neighbor, a grocer who could speak German, and brought the man, brought him back to speak with the old man. And they, got him some dinner. It was probably the first time anybody had been kind to this man in a long time. And Nagle learned something which startled him, that the old man was a veteran of the American Revolution, and that what Nagle had encountered, this man, his name was Joseph Winter, is actually the first homeless veteran about whom we know anything by name, whose story we know. And it's poignant that the description I've given, which comes from Nagle's diary, is very much the kind of description any of us might give of encountering a homeless person on the streets of Washington. And many of those homeless people, or in any other American city for that matter, a lot of those people are in fact veterans. Veteran homelessness remains a serious problem. Nagle learned that Winter had served in the militia, in the Pennsylvania militia during the Revolutionary War. He was from a small town near Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He was a weaver. And he'd been a weaver in his native Germany, but he had a family, but his wife and his children were all dead. And Winter had gravitated towards Philadelphia. He'd gotten too old, his fingers too stiff to weave anymore. And so he had become a homeless beggar. The country had no provision for veterans, and he was old. And you think about the American Revolution, it's important to frame this. The American Revolution had taken place in the 1770s and early 1780s. It was fought mostly by young men who were born in the 1750s. And if Joseph Winter had been born around 1750, he would have been 79 when Nagle met him. That is, by that time, the veterans of the American Revolution were old men, especially by the standards of that generation. Nagle was inspired to paint a portrait of Winter, and we were very lucky to acquire it. The story of the portrait is itself kind of poignant. It passed from hand to hand for a while, wound up in the collection of a museum in Chicago, which didn't display it, which had it in storage, and ultimately decided to sell it. And we were able to buy it at auction for just a very small price, because nobody wanted this old man. Nobody wanted him in 1829, and nobody wanted him 10 years ago. But we do. We do, because he symbolizes something very important to us. That is the service and the sacrifice of the people who actually won our revolution, who won our freedom, created this great republic. We give too much credit to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams. We spend a lot of time talking about them, and we don't talk as much about the ordinary people of the American Revolution as we ought to. There are reasons for that. One of them is that they're hard to get to know. We don't have photographs of them. I mean, World War II, World War I, the Civil War, those poignant young faces look out at us. And we know that they're real people, and they'll grow to be old men if they live beyond the war. But we have very, very few pictures of any kind of ordinary soldiers of the American Revolution. So we don't have an easy way to envision them. And the other thing is that they were not romantics. People in the 19th century, even the 20th century, who talk a lot about themselves. Even when we have, and it's rare, to have correspondence or diaries or memoirs of ordinary soldiers of the Revolution, they don't spend a lot of time talking about their own story. They're not as introspective as people would become later. And so even when we have documentation, it's usually not as revealing as we would like. And so they're distant and strange to us. They're hard to get to know. And so we don't think about them as much as we ought. What I found in doing this project, and the reason I think this book, if it has any value, it comes from this, is that in this project and then in writing it, that these people that I wound up writing about became very real to me. I felt like I got to know them through the documentation that survives. And a lot of it is documentation that relates to their service that wouldn't have been generated except for the fact that the United States wound up creating a pension system in the early 19th century. I'll get to that in a few minutes. During the war, there were no promise of pensions for ordinary soldiers. And there was a tradition in European warfare that the European states only cared for people who were wounded in combat and who were, permanently disabled. Some provisions were made for those kinds of people almost from the late Middle Ages on. They weren't generous provisions. They were mostly attempts to make sure that the people didn't fall onto the poor relief in their town or their community where they lived when they got home. And they really were a form of poor relief and not really so much a pension as we would think of it at all. The Continental Congress promised that if people were wounded in combat, they would receive some kind of pension. And the Congress tried to fulfill that pledge. It usually did so by asking the state where the person was from to step in to provide them with some kind of financial assistance. But that was the beginning of caring for veterans during the Revolutionary War. And one of the very first people to be recognized was surprisingly, interestingly, fascinatingly, was a woman. Her name was Margaret Corbin. And we don't think of women on the battlefield in the Revolutionary War, but women were on the battlefield in the Revolutionary War. And Margaret Corbin's story helps us to understand how that came to happen. It also illustrates that people who fought in the Revolutionary War did so for all sorts of reasons. Margaret Corbin was a young woman. She was in her 20s. She was married to a man named John Corbin, and they lived in central Pennsylvania. She was from Franklin County, Pennsylvania, which is it's not far from Gettysburg, although Gettysburg didn't exist when she was born. And she was an orphan. Her parents were killed. Father was killed by Indians. Her mother was taken by the Indians, and she never saw the mother again. Was raised on the Pennsylvania frontier by her uncle, and married young, didn't have any children. And when the revolution began, her husband, John, joined a Pennsylvania artillery unit. Now, these were simple people who lived on the frontier. They weren't sophisticated thinkers. They didn't read John Locke or Montesquieu. They didn't have, they weren't acquainted with theories of natural right, but they wanted to be independent. You know that. People who lived on the frontier, they didn't want to be told what to do. They didn't want to be told they couldn't settle farther west, which the British were attempting to prevent. They wanted to be free. And we can imagine it, we don't know, but that these were the kinds of reasons that John Corbin had for joining the Continental Artillery. Margaret went with him because she probably had nothing else to do. There was nowhere else for her to go. And women tended to go with their husbands, particularly those who joined the artillery, because the artillery was always in need of help of some kind or another, kind of basic manual labor. Of course, women in camp, whether they were with the artillery or not, washed clothes and cooked and nursed. Washington didn't like to have the camp filled with women, but he kind of grudgingly allowed it and made sure that the women got rations. But when battles began, women whose husbands were in the artillery, they often carried water and ammunition, powder bags, and so on from the rear up to the front lines. And that's what Margaret Corbin was doing in November of 1776. You have on your screen a picture. Believe it or not, this is the northern end of Manhattan Island from across the Harlem River. And everything that you see in this watercolor, which was done by a British officer, every inch of everything you see is city now. And in fact, the ridge you see in the back is Washington Heights. The George Washington Bridge comes across the Hudson River in the background of this image. And if you look in the middle distance in this image, you see an earthwork fort. That's Fort Washington. That would be today the eastern side of the Fort Washington Bridge, the George Washington Bridge it is that enters Manhattan. And then to the right of that, at the top of the ridge, you see a puff of smoke, two little puffs near one another. Well, the puff of smoke of those two closest to you, that's where Margaret Corbin was when the British attacked Fort Washington in November of 1776. Her husband was working the gun. He was probably a sponge man, the guy who had to put a damp sponge down the artillery tube to prevent powder from blowing up when you reloaded. And she carried water. And so you imagine being up on that ridge, you have to go find a creek or a spring or some source of water because you have to swab out the gun barrel. Well, he was killed outright. You see the puff of smoke closer to us. Well, that's a British light artillery unit that's firing on them. And in that firing, John Corbin was killed. Whatever the circumstance, however it was that he came to be killed, perhaps it was explosion of his own powder, misfire of his gun, or fire from the British. Margaret Corbin picked up the sponge and began working it. She joined the cannon crew and fought the gun for just a while before she herself was struck by either a grape shot or a musket ball. It tore through her shoulder, her left breast, her arm, and took out a part of her jaw. And obviously she was rendered incoherent and quickly near death, but the British overran the position and she was captured. And her wounds were tended to in a very rough way. The British didn't want to take women prisoners, so she was let go and was helped to American lines and ultimately was taken to Philadelphia to recuperate for some time. She was never able to resume normal life. The Army sent her out with the invalids to West Point, and she lived there with the Invalid Corps for most of the Revolutionary War and lived on in West Point until she died in 1800, was buried in a nameless grave. But in 1779, the Continental Congress, in recognition of the fact that she had been wounded, grievously wounded in combat, awarded her half pay of a private for the remainder of her life. She was the first woman ever to receive a military pension in American history. And we don't have any papers of Margaret Corbin. We can't interview her. We can only learn about her story. But she was a soldier of the Revolution as surely as her husband and the men around her. A person who had ambitions and dreams and for whom this war meant something. And if we were to understand this war, understand our nation's origins, we need to understand why people like Joseph Corbin or Margaret Winter fought in that war. Now, Congress worked very hard to get American soldiers to join the Continental Army. It made lots of pledges and lots of promises. It made promises of a 100-acre land grant to anyone who would join as a private the Continental Line. Keep in mind, the Continental Congress did this at a time when the Congress of the United States had control of no land whatsoever. It could at best hope that the states would fulfill the promise that Congress was making. If you will, this promise in 1775 was sort of the mother of all unfunded mandates. They had absolutely no way of fulfilling this promise. Soldiers were promised that they would receive a bounty or a bonus at the end of their service if they served a certain length of time. Of course, they were promised regular pay. And none of these promises were fulfilled during the course of the war or for a long time thereafter. By the time the revolution came to an end in 1783, Congress was effectively bankrupt. Without the power to tax, it had no money. And as the war was coming to an end, Congress directed George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, to furlough the entire army, to get the men out of camp as quickly as possible, which was done in the early summer of 1783. The soldiers were discharged. We had in our exhibition, we have in the exhibition, I hope you get to see it if you haven't, when all of this unpleasantness is over. We'll reopen it for a time. One of the pieces in the exhibition, very simple document, is the discharge paper given to a young New York soldier named John Hall. I think we're going to get to see that on the screen. Here it is. It's not much to look at. These were hastily printed, thousands of them, and sent to Washington's camp and filled out. Unless you've got a big screen, you probably can't see it. It has John Hall's name. He served in a New York regiment, and it's signed by George Washington. And indeed, at the bottom, it says that Hall was awarded the Badge of Merit, which was a badge that Washington had created to recognize honorable service by soldiers. And the Badge of Merit was a little different than what we call the Badge of Military Merit. There were two. The Badge of Military Merit was quite special and was only awarded to a very few. And with it came a purple heart, a cloth purple heart that you got to wear on your coat. Washington had devised this, and it was one of the world's first decorations for ordinary soldiers. But the badge of merit that John Hall was awarded was a little simpler than that. Hall went home to upstate New York, where he lived until 1818. And though he sought repeatedly to get the 100-acre land grant that had been promised to him, he never got it. Congress had never made provision for his unit to get the land that had been promised to them, and he died without receiving it. This was a common experience. When the soldiers were discharged in the summer of 1783, most of them were owed back pay. And to discharge that obligation, the Army was authorized to issue them promissory notes that a certain number of years after the independence of the United States was achieved, after peace was declared, they would be paid a certain amount of money. But until that time, all they had were these promissory notes, which were running at interest. Well, for young men, some of whom had spent 8 years in the service of the United States, these promissory notes were next to useless. And so they sold them for pennies on the dollar to anybody who would buy them. One soldier, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, who explained that he sold his for about 5 cents on the dollar. And with the money, he was able to buy some decent clothes to walk home in. He couldn't buy a horse, he couldn't buy anything, but he didn't want to show up in front of his family in the tatters that he'd been serving in at the end of the war. And that once he bought the clothes to go home in and a little bit of food to tide him over on the walk home, that was all that his pay from the Revolutionary War that was owed to him would buy, because he had to sell these promissory notes for just a fraction of what they were worth. He had no choice. These men went home with nothing for the most part, but the consciousness of duty faithfully performed. It's extraordinary that so many of them were proud enough of what they had done that sufficed. Because most of them had given up, those particularly who had served a long time, they had given up a large part of the most important and productive, or should be productive, parts of their young manhood. People who had joined the Army at 20 or 21 were now 27 or 28. And that's the period in life where someone is establishing themselves in a trade or starting a farm, getting married, beginning a family, and beginning to accumulate the goods of life. And these young men had not done that. Most of them went home with nothing, but the pride that they had, and they were not celebrated. We think in hindsight, well, the heroes of the Revolution, that these people must have been celebrated when they came home. And in fact, they weren't. People were rather distrustful. There were traditions in Europe and in England that the people who'd served in the Army were generally coarsened by it, that it wasn't a good experience, and that they weren't to be trusted. And so they all had an extraordinarily hard time getting their life going. This was not just true for private soldiers, for enlisted men. It was true for the officers as well. Most of them were young men. We think of Washington or Henry Knox. Henry Knox, of course, very young. It's a terrible thing that we know these men only through portraits painted, when they were old. And so I say Henry Knox, and you have this mental image, I'm sure, that pops into your head of a big, heavy, gray-haired old man. When in fact, when George Washington met Henry Knox in the Continental Army camps outside of Boston in 1775, he was what, 21 years old. He was a young man, um, and many of the officers were. They were young men who essentially traded, for the most part, traded their 20s for the cause of American independence. And at the end of it, lots of promises had been made to them, which were not going to be fulfilled immediately either. Congress was bankrupt, and they understood that. Most of them had become nationalists. They wanted the government to acquire some power, particularly the power to tax, so that it would have the power, the wherewithal to fulfill the promises that it had made to them. But they too did an extraordinary thing. We see the enlisted men who went home peaceably, without riot, without any things we could imagine under the circumstances. The officers did the same thing, and all they did was found our organization, the Society of the Cincinnati, which is the nation's oldest veterans organization. They founded it for the purpose of providing for one another. Here's the institution of the Society of the Cincinnati, which, by the way, if I had a chance to nominate some great document that belongs in the rotunda of the National Archives with our Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, I would say the institution of the Society of the Cincinnati has a place, perhaps not quite as elevated as all of that, but a place, because it's a pledge made by the officers of the Continental Army to accept civilian government, civilian rule, which is a great tradition and one of the great traditions of our republic, the subordination of the military to civilian authority, to go home peaceably, to agitate and to press, as they did, for the fulfillment of the promises that had been made to them, but above all, to care for one another. Not to look always to government to care for them, but to care for one another and to perpetuate the memory of the great achievement that they had achieved together, the independence of the United States and the establishment of the first great republic of modern times. That's the meaning of the Society of the Cincinnati and its institution. And from its earliest days, the Society took on this role of providing for veterans. We have wonderful archives, not just of the General Society of the Cincinnati at Anderson House, but also of our constituent societies, and some of them are entrusted to our care. We looked through those carefully to see the best examples of the Society's philanthropic role, caring for its own, what in the 18th century was called benevolence, caring for its own. Here's one, a soldier named John Mccoy. Now, Mccoy was a little older than most of the junior officers of the Revolution. Here's his petition to the Maryland Society of the Cincinnati. It's part of the Maryland Society's archives, which are stored at Anderson House. We're very proud to have them there. Mccoy was born in 1745, which means he was a little older than most of the soldiers around him. He was a non-commissioned officer for much of the Revolution, and toward the end he became a lieutenant. And after he was commissioned a lieutenant, when the war came to an end, he was eligible to join the Society of the Cincinnati of Maryland. He didn't live in Maryland for very long, though. After the American Revolution, he moved ultimately to Erie County, Pennsylvania, which up on Lake Erie, which was on the frontier in the 1780s and actually wasn't open to settlement until 1790. And he was destitute by 1810. So 1745, that he's 65 years old when he wrote this document. I think you can see that it's clearly written, but shaky. It's an old man's document. He explained that he said, "I have no real estate to depend on." He said, "I betook myself after the war to hard labor, but I could barely support myself by it. I was obliged by my circumstances to part with my certificates at an early day at the end of the war and at a low rate, as is set forth in the application I have written to you. I am in a strange country." He's off in the frontier of northwestern Pennsylvania. "I am in a strange country, in poverty and distress, afflicted with a palsy and other diseases that old age and fatigue have brought on me. I have no property and very little personal property. I have 2 cows and a calf, 2 sheep, 7 head of swine, some household furniture. It's all I have to support me in my last days. I pray your honorable society to consider the care of a brother soldier that was with you at Long Island and at White Plains and fought with you at Princeton and Germantown and Brandywine, and from there to South Carolina and to the end of the war. And in that little sketch is a genuine sketch of a Maryland soldier. The Maryland line was one of the great, produced some of the great units of the American Revolution, heroes who fought from the beginning of the war and from the fights around New York all the way through the campaigns of Greene's army in the South. And this John Mccoy had been with them, finally as a lieutenant. And the Maryland Society of the Cincinnati sent him $50, which may not sound like a lot, but $50 in 1810 is actually a considerable amount of money. The society itself, by itself, couldn't take care of even all of the officers and their needs after the war, particularly as they began to grow older. And there was a lot of agitation in Congress after the Constitution was adopted and Congress was established, and we had taxing power. So the government had means to do something for its veterans, a term rarely used, by the way. They're referred to constantly as old soldiers or soldiers of the last war. The term veterans, which was current, was not used much until the 1820s or 30s. They're old soldiers. There was agitation in Congress, in the first Congress of the United States, to go back and pay the soldiers who had fought and who had received these promissory notes at the end of the war. And even if they had sold off their promissory notes, as the one soldier had, he said, for 5 cents on the dollar, to give them, to go back in the records and find out what those men had been paid and to pay them full, what had been owed to them in 1783 when the Army had dissolved. And there was a lot of agitation about this. There were veteran officers, Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury, who was reluctantly opposed to this. He said, we can't do this. We have to pay off the people who actually hold those debt certificates. So when we fund the national debt, we have to pay the people who bought them, the speculators who bought them. If we don't do that, the national debt will never have any value. People will never invest in our national debt if we don't pay the people who actually hold it. We can't go back and pay the people who originally held the debt, who sold off those debt instruments. And there were arguments made that, well, let's at least give them part of the money. There were all kinds of compromise positions suggested, but ultimately Congress decided that it would only pay the people who held the debt and left the soldiers without any additional pay. So 7 and 8 years after the Revolution, despite strident arguments made to support paying off these impoverished soldiers, it was not done. Now, one of the things that had been done at the beginning of the war was to promise everybody, as I said, a land grant. Both states had made these promises as well as the Congress. And the states were in a better position to provide it. They had large swaths of unclaimed land that they could grant to soldiers of the Revolution. It took them years, however, to do so. One of them, whose story intrigued me, we have in our collections a land grant. And it is, like land grants are in general, a kind of tedious document. Its attraction to collectors is it's signed by James Madison. So there are people who want the signature of James Madison, but it isn't the signature of the President of the United States on this document that interested me as much as it is the man to whom it was issued. It had been issued to a Virginia lieutenant whose name was Robert Elliott. Elliott lived in the southern part of the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and then had moved later to Montgomery County, Virginia. Here we go. This is a boring document. I assure you, it's not fun to look at and fun to read. It's not exciting. But there's a story behind it. Like there are stories about all of the documents that made up this exhibition and that are in the book. Every one relates to a story of a real person. And that if you dig a little bit, you scratch this beyond the surface, you reach that story. This land grant was issued to Mr. Elliott, Robert Elliott, but he immediately sold it off to a speculator named James Taylor, who was a Virginia surveyor. It's for land in southern Ohio, land that Virginia had set aside to give to its veterans, and in that military district. But Elliott, he lived on what he called, and he wrote in a document, he said, I live on Elliott's Creek. It's not clear whether he named it Elliott's Creek or somebody else did, but he lived on Elliott's Creek in the mountain fastnesses of Montgomery County, Virginia. And he was a very proud man. He had an opportunity in 1818 when the first Pension Act was passed by the United States Congress to apply for a pension, but he didn't do it. He was then probably about 77 years old, but I said, no, I don't need that. And he waited until 1827, 9 years later, and then he finally decided he needed to apply for a federal pension. He was then getting quite elderly. And he explained that his whole property at that time consisted of a tract of rough mountain land containing about 150 acres. I have one horse beast, very old and inferior, worth $10, 5 head of neat cattle, some household furniture corresponding in quality with my humble circumstances, and some farming utensils worth very little, say about $20. He had not applied for a pension earlier. I love this. He had not applied for a pension earlier, he wrote, because a sense of pride forbid me until the necessities became too urgent to be resisted. And I felt that the pride of having been a soldier was in some measure debased by stooping to ask such a favor. And for a long time, I cherished the hope that I would be able to rub along without begging this bounty from my country. But my wants now compel me to ask this assistance. Robert Elliott did, in fact, get a pension from the federal government. He died in 1838 when he was approaching 100 years old. And his widow, Elizabeth, to whom he was married in 1790, was granted a widow's pension in 1839, and she was still collecting it 20 years later. These were proud people, strong people. They had lived hard lives. And as they grew old, they needed assistance. And it's fortunate that they got it. Now, sometimes we'll come across the face of somebody who doesn't necessarily look like they needed assistance. And the next one is sort of is one of my favorite stories from this book. It's the story of a man named Brian Rossiter. Rossiter, oh, here he is. Now he looks like a prosperous fellow, doesn't he? In this proud uniform. And you think, well, surely this man who could have this portrait painted, it's painted by John Trumbull, by the way, one of the great portrait painters of the late 18th and 19th centuries. Surely he didn't need a pension. Well, in fact, Brian Rossiter was a sergeant during the Revolutionary War, was born in Connecticut and moved to New York City after the war, where he was for many years, he drove a delivery wagon. And in the late 1790s, he had saved up enough money to start a business as a fruit seller. He peddled fruit in one of New York City's markets, which meant he probably got up at 3 or 4 in the morning to go and set up a market stall. This was done 5 or 6 days a week, selling produce probably grown in westernmost Long Island and brought across the East River to New York, day in and day out. He did this for the rest of his life, for the teens and 20s and into the 30s. And the American Revolution, his service in the Revolutionary War, he served in the entire revolution from the time he joined the army in 1776 when he was 16 years old and was mustered out in 1783 with the rest of the army as a sergeant, having served for 7 years. So at the advanced age of 23, the great adventure of his life was over. We only see his face here, the fruit seller, because he was a neighbor of an officer of the New York Society of the Cincinnati, and he was given the role of being the sergeant at arms of the New York Society of the Cincinnati, an invented position. And in fact, this uniform is not a military uniform at all, although it's based on a contemporary military uniform. It's the specially designed uniform of the Sergeant at Arms of the New York State Society of the Cincinnati. And in fact, this painting, this portrait, which is one of the great treasures of the society, is owned by the New York State Society of the Cincinnati to this day. Trumbull gave it to the New York State Society. The chevrons you see on Rossiter's left sleeve, that's the indication of the badge of merit that he had won for his long service in the Revolutionary War. This is one of the few fine paintings of an enlisted man of the American Revolution that exists. And it only exists because of his unusual association with the New York State Society of the Cincinnati. As far as we know, Trumbull didn't charge anyone for painting this portrait. Rossiter, like the rest, had been promised things. He didn't get his land grant, the 100 acres he'd been promised, until 1819. And when he got it, we think he immediately sold it, because that same year he bought a little modest house in what's now the East Village in New York City, where he lived for the remainder of his life from the proceeds of that land grant. That was very common, by the way. The land grants were something governments could give as a reward for service, but most people had settled lives, and so they sold their land grants. They didn't necessarily want to go live there. They were fungible. But Brian Rossiter seems to have turned his land grant into the little house in New York City where he lived for the rest of his life. These men took advantage, if taking advantage is what we would call it, of the first pension law the United States ever passed, the Pension Act of 1818. The Pension Act of 1818 was pushed by President Monroe, who, as I already said, President Monroe was an officer of the Continental Army and was very sympathetic to veterans as they aged. And by 1818, dial back and think, okay, the average Continental Army soldier would have been born around 1750 or 1755. By 1818, they would be in their late 60s, mid 60s at the youngest, but starting to age. And so as some of them slipped into poverty, the need to provide for them in their old age became apparent. But pension was kind of a dirty word in 18th and even in early 19th century America and in Europe. Pensions were used by political parties to curry favor. You pension off a certain group of people, well, you can count on their votes at the election, their political support. Pension was associated with corruption. And a lot of people argued that, no, we shouldn't give pensions to people who served us in the Revolution. Number one, we paid them, never mind the fact that we had actually not paid them as we promised, and that everyone benefited from the free society the Revolution had created, and its veterans did too. We don't owe them anything extra. This was the argument. On the other side were Monroe and others who said, we need to take care of those who have real needs. And so the pension law of 1818 provided that men who had served in the Continental Army, who, as enlisted men, who were in financial need and would say that they had a real financial need, could apply for pensions. Pensions would be modest, on the order of $96 a year for a private, which, by the way, won't provide your housing, but you can, for $96 a year in 1819, you can eat. You can buy some modest clothes from time to time and fuel to heat your modest home. It's enough money to do that. I know it only sounds like a couple dollars a week, but it's enough. So Congress adopted this pension law in 1818. Now, it was a time after the War of 1812 when Congress felt flush. But almost immediately after that pension law was passed, the United States slipped into one of the worst economic downturns of the 19th century. It's associated with what we call the Panic of 1819. And most of the revenue of the United States government came from duties on imported goods. We didn't have an income tax in those days. And so import duties was the main source of revenue, and the import duties dried up because people were in financial distress. They couldn't buy imported goods. And so the market for imported goods dried up, imports dried up, tax revenue from imports dried up. And the government found itself with millions of dollars in obligations of annual pension payments that it couldn't afford. Well, immediately enter into the equation the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. Congress charged Calhoun to review the people who had been pensioned off under the 1818 law. There were tens of thousands of them, many more than had been expected, and to see who was really in need. And there was a revision to the pension law passed that said that if you needed to come forward to a magistrate, to a judge, or to a justice of the peace, and swear to an affidavit describing all of your assets, all of your personal property, your clothing, your furniture, the books that you own, anything that you have, your livestock and horses, you need to come and tell us what that is so we can make judgment about whether you are really in need, which of course was humiliating to the thousands of men who had applied for these pensions, but thousands of them did it anyway. In 1820 and 21 and 22, they went ahead and filled out these affidavits and told the government what they had. Well, now, by the way, as a historian, you can't imagine, as humiliating as it was for the men who had to do it, you can't imagine a greater treasure trove of documents to understand the lives of ordinary people. You know, what were the lives of men who fought in the Revolution and their families like in 1820, 50 odd years, 40 odd years after the Revolution had taken place? These tell us an awful lot. And you know, there was one that we had having the exhibition. I keep saying had in the exhibition. The exhibition will reopen when this pandemic winds down and we can reopen Anderson House, and you'll be able to come and see these things, and I hope you will. There's one application that's in our exhibition that sort of stands for all of these renewal applications. It's a particularly poignant one. It was submitted by another New Yorker, a man named Thomas DeRussy. Now, DeRussy was French, and he had a very, very interesting story. He was a native of Brittany in France when the American Revolution began, and was in Paris. He had some experience in the French merchant marine, and Benjamin Franklin recruited him to serve in John Paul Jones' little flotilla with the Bonhomme Richard, and he served aboard the Pallas, a smaller ship. And DeRussy was its lieutenant. And he served with Jones and his flotilla at the famous Battle of Flamborough Head. That's where Jones said, you know, I have not yet begun to fight, when challenged by the British captain. And DeRussy had participated in this. In fact, his application describes the Battle of Flamborough Head in great detail. Here's his application. It's a partially printed form. It's in our collection. After the Revolutionary War was over, he moved to Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, and started a plantation, but he lost it in the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s and came to New York City, where he tried to set himself up as a merchant. He did that for several years, was never a very successful merchant. And by the early 19th century, he got his living mainly by teaching school in his house. And he taught all sorts of subjects, but primarily French. If you wanted to learn French, you went to Monsieur DeRussy at his house. And in this affidavit he issued here, he went to a New York court, as you can see in the upper left, to swear it, to say what it was that he had. He had lots and lots of books, of course, which he used in the teaching of French. He had a whole room full of chairs and desks for the young students he taught, and all of that shows up. It's probably the first documentation that exists of a private school in New York City, is in this pension application, because he has to say everything he owns. And he has to submit this affidavit because John C. Calhoun has struck him from the pension list. He'd gotten a pension under the 1818 law, but Calhoun and his clerks had decided that DeRussy probably had too much, and he didn't deserve it. Well, at the time that he issued this additional application explaining everything he owns, DeRussy was very ill. He was actually mortally ill. He would die not too long. But he wrote to Calhoun and he said, in an effort to be fair to the country, I have sold all of the books that I had. And it's, while true, I spent a lot of money on those books. You know, used books aren't worth so much. And all I got for them was $42, a whole room full of books. And, you know, I've liquidated all of my assets so that I can take care of myself, but I hope you will renew my application. Calhoun in this case was hard-hearted. We think he actually looked at most of these applications himself, and he decided that no, that DeRussy's application would not be renewed. Unfortunately, I suppose, in a sense, DeRussy didn't live to get the no reply. In fact, 3 days after Calhoun decided that to reject his application for renewal of his pension, DeRussy died in New York, indigent and forgotten. Except that we won't forget him because he's in our collections, and he is, like hundreds of others, a hero of the Revolution. Now, we have in our collection a wonderful portrait of another person who genuinely is a hero of the Revolution, who got caught up in this story as well. His name was Ebenezer Huntington. Here he is. Some of you have seen this painting. This is, again, by John Trumbull, wonderful portrait of Huntington. He was a lieutenant colonel at the end of the American Revolution. He left Yale 3 weeks before his graduation, right after the Lexington alarm, and joined the Army first as a private, served the entirety of the war. Extraordinary soldier. We have all of his correspondence from the war as well, and grumbled the whole time about how ungrateful the country was, how undeserving it was of the sacrifices of its soldiers. But he was one of the very last soldiers to lay down his commission in December of 1783 and go home. He tried to set himself up as a merchant. He wasn't particularly successful. Again, he was one of these young men who had given up his 20s to the service of the United States. He was from a prominent family, so he was elected to Congress in the 18-teens, and as a congressman, he argued strenuously in favor of the pension law of 1818, and was, in the end, its highest ranking beneficiary, because he was indigent by 1820. Now, he was indigent, but he was living in a beautiful house in Norwich, Connecticut, that he'd inherited. You know, there were no property taxes at the time, so there was no way he didn't have to give up his house, but he had barely enough money to heat the house and to eat. And so he acquired a pension, which became a local scandal, much to his embarrassment. The little pension that he got under the Pension Act of 1818 became sort of made him a whipping boy in the Connecticut newspapers in the middle of the 1820s. The question was, should we give pensions to people who you know, who have property, as he did? And well, ultimately, you know, his pension was taken away, and then it was finally restored. The 1820s was the period in which the battle over pensions was fought, and it was a period when people felt extremely strong about the issue one way or the other. It became a major issue in the presidential campaign of 1828. And Andrew Jackson, who's running for president in 1828, himself a veteran of the militia as a boy during the Revolution, felt very strongly that the people who had fought in the Revolution should be taken care of. And he argued strenuously for a broader pension law that would embrace the militia. There was a lot of debate about this because it was people had financial cold feet about whether a new pension law, more expensive, should be passed. But by 1832, when this debate really heated up, the United States was flush again. You know, the economic dislocation of the early 1820s was in the distant past, and Congress felt that it could afford to to issue pensions generously, and it did. It passed a pension law in 1832, which provided for universal pensions for all soldiers who had fought in the American Revolutionary War, even those who'd fought for just a few months, even those who had served in the militia. This was very important to President Jackson. And this produced itself another wave of applications from tens of thousands of veterans. No one predicted how many there would be. And by 1833, just a year later, payments on those pensions was the largest expenditure of the United States government, dwarfed everything else. But in 1832 and 1833, the government of the United States could well afford it. Believe it or not, the budget of the United States in 1832 was only 1/4 of the national government's revenue. And we took in 4 times as much revenue in taxes as we needed to spend in 1832. In the age now when deficit spending is usual, the idea that we would have 4 times as much money coming into the treasury in a year as we needed is almost incomprehensible. Those pensions took up a vast amount of that money. And they continued to be paid out to veterans of the American Revolution all the way through the end of that generation. Now, the revolutionary generation lived on until the Civil War. There weren't very many veterans of the Revolution left at the time of the Civil War in the 1850s and then into the 1860s, but there were a few. The numbers dropped precipitously during the 1840s and 50s, as you might imagine. In the 1840s, these men were mostly in their 80s and 90s, and by 1860, anyone who had fought in the Revolutionary War was reaching 100 years old. But there were still men who had fought in the Revolution. They tended to be young men. Perhaps they'd been born in the early 1760s and had entered the war as teenagers at the very end of the war. But there were still veterans of the American Revolution alive at the time of the Civil War. And this means that there were men who fought in the American Revolution who lived long enough to be photographed. And we have in the show several photographs. We're blessed to have in our collection several original photographs of men who fought in the Revolutionary War. But here's one of them. It's one of my favorites. It's one of my favorite things in this exhibition and in the book. This is a man named George Warner. Photograph was taken in the 1850s, and he had fought as a young man in Vermont at the Battle of Bennington. There were dozens of photographs, scores of photographs of men like this who had fought in the Revolutionary War, taken in the 1850s. And when you see them, they're startling because you're coming in contact with them in a way that we're familiar with, that we're intellectually receptive to. This looks like a real person to us. And in a way that Gilbert Stuart or John Trumbull's portraits don't. The photographs resonate to us and they become real. But of course, they were all very real. All of these people, they all had diverse reasons for fighting for us, for suffering for us, many for dying for us. And they deserve to be honored and respected. Ultimately, our country learned to honor and respect our veterans. But it took a lifetime for us to discharge the obligations that we had to them. Too many of them died, not even having received the basic payments that they'd been promised. But in the end, we learned to honor them. And in the process, we embraced one of the great consequences of our revolution. The revolution proclaimed, as we know, that all men are created equal. And what universal equality meant was something that was going to be worked out. There's a great fallacy in our revolution. Now, I love Jefferson's writing. He's one of the great rhetoricians of all time, but he says something very silly in the Declaration of Independence. He says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Nothing was less self-evident in 1776 than that. It was a world in which people were profoundly unequal. And it would remain so. It remains so to our own time. But the story of our country is the gradual realization, getting closer and closer to that ideal, to that self-evident truth, not just that men are equal or that white men are equal or that men alone, not that this doesn't include women. And we've learned and we've expanded and we've benefited tremendously from the growth of liberal democracy, which is it's the great legacy of our country to the world. And it's a legacy of our revolution, that idealism. And the people who fought the revolution and who were its veterans and who lived to be honored helped to make that democracy. And our honoring them is a reflection of the realization of the immense value of ordinary people to the life of free society. It isn't just George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, it's Thomas DeRussy and Ebenezer Huntington and Brian Rossiter and Margaret Corbin and elderly men like Joseph Winter huddled in snowy streets under makeshift shelters. Those are the people who made our free republic. Those are the people who protect our free republic. They continue to do so. This is a nation made by ordinary people who sacrifice. It's a great story, the story of the veterans of the revolution. I don't know that I've done it justice, but I hope if you have a chance to look at the book, and I certainly hope you have a chance to see the exhibition, that you will be as inspired by it, even half as inspired by these stories as I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack, for that wonderful talk and a great introduction to the book and to this important history. And hope everyone is able to come visit in person when we open up our exhibition, when the world is a little bit more settled. I'm going to now introduce Andy Morse, our Director of Development, who is going to kick off the question and answer.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Jack, this was just terrific. This audience is very familiar with Washington's silent toast, but you've got a silent virtual ovation going on out there that you wouldn't believe it if you could see it. But we have some really terrific questions, so let's take a few minutes to go through these, but get after them as quickly as we can, Jack. While Kelsey's searching through some that are coming through now, let me start with a couple of them. This is a learned enough audience, of course, to know that we're really fast approaching the 200th anniversary of Lafayette's visit to America. So you mentioned in the book that the 1820s are an important time for how this issue was evolving. What, if any, influence did impact did Lafayette's visit to America have on this cause making progress?
I should have mentioned it because it's enormous. When Lafayette came back to America in the 1820s, he was, of course, he'd been a major general in the Revolutionary War, appointed a major general at the age of 19 by the Continental Congress. One of the fly-on-the-wall moments I would like to see is when Lafayette was introduced for the first time to George Washington as his newest major general, because Washington was frustrated by Congress appointing, commissioning all these French officers who were appearing in America, and now it's a French teenager. Wealthy family, seems like a nice guy, but for goodness sakes. And of course, Lafayette and Washington became intimates. By 1824, when he returned to America, Lafayette was the senior surviving veteran of the American Revolution. He was the only surviving major general. I think there was one surviving brigadier general, don't quote me on that, elsewhere, but he was the personal embodiment of the American Revolution in many ways. And everywhere he went, there were enormous parades and public ceremonies. And the people who organized those parades and public ceremonies, like the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument or the laying of the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument near Boston, the organizers put the veterans of the battles or the local veterans in the front row of the audience. And Lafayette never failed to, when he got up to acknowledge the crowd and to say his thanks for this effusive welcome that he received, he never failed to recognize them and to refer to them, even enlisted men, as his brothers in arms. And you can sort of picture it, when these things break up, that he would meet with them and shake hands with them. And these men they were associated with the great Lafayette. And this reminded Americans in the middle of the 1820s of how much they owed to the people who had won the revolution. And the officers, the senior officers, the generals, except for Lafayette, they were all gone. And the adulation that had gone to Lafayette was shifted to these men. And And thereafter was from that moment forward in American history, you see these men that they are the toast of every 4th of July parade and ceremony in every small town where they live. They become sort of local celebrities. And so, no, it's a really important moment in the development of our appreciation of the ordinary men who fought the revolution. Lafayette helped see to it.
Great. That's great. You know, it's interesting looking at these questions, Jack. The one of them is a gentleman who's taught high school history for 38 years, who is so glad to have access to this material, and a couple others echo the comment of just thank you for writing this, not only giving this lecture, but writing this book and contributing to the scholarship the way you have. You gave a perfect segue, because no talk of yours would be complete without George Washington. So what did the general really think about this subject overall? What do you know about that?
That's interesting. Washington, as you know, Andy, and everyone here who's studied Washington, and I think I've probably got a lot of Washington students in this audience. Washington evolved. He was not a self-satisfied man for all that he'd accomplished, and he was always rethinking things. At the beginning of the revolution, I think Washington's attitudes about ordinary soldiers were probably fairly conventional. So they were offered pay and of course clothing and food, and they would be cared for. But ordinary soldiers were not like gentlemen. They weren't people who were capable of truly disinterested behavior. Not like a gentleman like himself who was sacrificing so much to serve. He didn't need the pay, and in fact had dismissed the idea of being paid. He would serve without pay. But ordinary soldiers wanted to be paid. They were serving for bounties. They were serving for land grants. That was Washington's attitude at the beginning of the war. But within a couple of years of the beginning of the war, you see a shift in Washington's attitude. And one of the dramatic moments you see this is in the winter of 1776, when he calls them together to ask them to stay on, and he refers to them as gentlemen. He says, "Gentlemen, if you will serve just a few weeks longer, you will do a greater thing for your country than you could do in any comparable amount of time for the remainder of your life." But it's the way he begins, which is not startling to us. We gentleman is a throw off in our society. We refer to people as gentlemen who we know are not. But in the 18th century, the title of a gentleman was a sort of sacred thing, and it was reserved for people who of a kind of elevated consciousness. That's the idea of gentility, and ordinary people were not capable of it in 18th century thought. But Washington changes that. He thinks that gentility is not a matter of table manners or dress or deportment or education. He thinks it's a moral condition. And from that moment forward, Washington's attitudes about the ordinary men who serve under him changes. And by the end of the war, Washington is dedicated to them and their interests. He's dedicated to the officers too. And at the end of the war, he issues a circular letter, which is widely published, in which he says, the Army has disbanded, but it's very important for the country to fulfill the promises it has made to the officers and to the enlisted men. He even suggests that perhaps the enlisted men should be exempted from taxation for the remainder of their lives. That's a startling proposition. I wonder how veterans would feel about that today. If we said, that if you've served honorably in the United States Armed Forces, you never pay income tax again. I think we could get a few votes for that from the veterans lobby. It was a suggestion that Washington made. Washington was deeply bothered by the debate about discrimination, that is, about how to repay soldiers who had to sell off their debt certificates at the end of the war. This debate that went on when Washington was president. He did not step into it, but he does have an exchange with James Madison where he expresses strong sympathy for the idea of dealing with the veterans in a more generous way than was ultimately done. Washington grew to respect and honor ordinary men, and that had an enormous influence on the country in the long term.
That's great. Kelsey, there's so many more, and I know we can't all get to them, but why don't you grab a couple more that are at the top of the stack there?
Yeah, it is hard to choose between these, but had a few questions about widows and widows' pensions. When did those come into practice? How many women were able to take advantage of this opportunity? Were they experiencing destitution similar to their husbands?
This is actually interesting, and if I could have held you for 2 hours rather than one, I would have gotten into it. The Congress extends the pension of 1832 to widows a few years later. And when it does so, it says if the husband dies, you can continue to get his pension thereafter. And so widows' pensions are instituted. But at first they say you have to have been married to your husband during his service. So if you got married after the war, you don't count. And of course, there aren't as many of those. So that's a much more, that's a fiscally conservative measure. But 2 years later, Congress extends it. He says, well, if you got married up to 7 years after the war, we'll count you in, which makes better sense. I mean, young men who go off to war, most of the soldiers of the Continental Army, as far as we know, there's been some study of this, not very comprehensive, were not married. They don't get married till the war is over. And so that original act didn't do much. The 7-year provision did a lot. And so a lot of widows seek pensions. And then in the 1840s, now, of course, the people are getting very old. The rules are any widow of any veteran. Doesn't matter when they were married. And actually, there's a kind of humorous one, if you'll indulge me. Y'all are all indulging me, so you'll indulge me on this. There was a young woman named Esther. This is not, by the way, a limerick. I don't have the next line of the limerick. There was a young woman named Esther, and Esther in the late 1830s, imprudently, according to her family, married an elderly veteran of the Revolutionary War. She was about 18 at the time. Don't quote me on that, but she was born about 1820. And the veteran that she married had been born about 1750. So he was, 70 when she was born. And he was in his late 80s when they got married, and she was a teenager. And he lived a pensioned off veteran for another 4 or 5 years. In fact, they didn't live together. They only lived together for about 6 months or a year. And he was so decrepit, he went off to live with one of his own then elderly children, but leaving his wife, Esther, to live with her family. And then he died. And Esther got his pension as a widow, was qualified. Esther Damon, her name was, lived until 1906 and continued to draw a widow's pension from the Revolutionary War until 1906. As the last pension paid out was paid out to a widow. I want to throw in one more because that one is kind of humorous, and this one is not. In the 1840s and 50s, you see a fair number of applications for pensions that come from the widows of African American soldiers of the Revolution. Now we don't. Here's a big mistake. We don't appreciate how many soldiers of the Revolutionary War were African American soldiers. The raw number seems kind of small. It's about 9,000 in the Continental Service and in the militia and privateers as Teamsters. 9,000 doesn't sound like a lot, but the average length of a Black man's service in the armed forces during the Revolution was 4 years. The average white participant was less than a year because most were militia and they'd serve for a short time. And as a consequence, that 9,000, they were there most of the time. And as the war wore on and it became more and more difficult to recruit soldiers, the Black presence in the armed forces grew. Probably at the very end of the war, something like at least 15, hard to tell, but my guess is something like 15% of the armed forces of the United States at the end of the Revolution were Black. Black soldiers, Black sailors, Teamsters, and so forth. And those people were eligible for pensions. but it was hard for them in many cases to prove their case, partly because the documentation of their service tended to be poor. In this project, I studied one of them. His name was Peter Hunter, and his widow sought a pension in the 1840s. And there were all kinds of impediments, to start with black marriages, and she needed to prove her marriage. They weren't as reliably documented, since she couldn't provide a certificate that demonstrated that she and her husband had been married. And while her husband's service, in hindsight, you can see it. He was from Farmington, Connecticut, and there it is on the muster roll, but it's listed as Peter Negro. There's no last name. He was a free black, but he's not, the no last name was listed when he was on the enlistment document, but that's him. State of Connecticut still owns that document, but he had died and moved to Vermont, and she sought this widow's pension. We have some documentation on it in our collection, but we don't see that she ever received it. Now, it's possible she abandoned the attempt. It's possible that she died. She was quite elderly, but it's also just as possible that the pension office said no, not no because of racial discrimination, but no because of the documentation isn't there. And the documentation isn't there because of essentially racial preferences in the way the documentation was kept. And those are realities that we have to deal with. Black service in the Revolution was important. It was vital to the achievement of American independence, and that's reflected in these documents. That's far afield from your question about widows, but it comes up particularly with African American widows in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And if you have another question, I'll promise to try to keep the answer succinct. I'm not famous for that.
So I think we'll do one more question because we're nearing 8 o'clock, and this is about archives. Does the Society Archives cover all states, and does it have materials on the frontier? And kind of a secondary question is, where can folks who want to do more research on their ancestors who were veterans, where can they find those pension records and pension applications?
That's really two separate questions. I'll try to answer them. I'm not the right person to answer about the depth and breadth of our collections. We have records that relate to many states, particularly officers, because the officers joined the Society of the Cincinnati at the end of the war. So if your ancestor is an officer who survived the war and had either was eligible or did join the Society of the Cincinnati, we may well have some evidence about your ancestor that would be useful to you. The treasure trove of documentation about Civil War, about Revolutionary War ancestors is contained in National Archive pension Veterans Administration files that are in the National Archives. And blessedly, because I can remember the bad old days when if you wanted to see them, you went to the National Archives or to a depository library and you cranked microfilm. Blessedly, you can look at every one of those pension files today on your computer. Without leaving your house, you can see every existing Revolutionary War pension file in the possession of the National Archives using Fold 3, which is the military history division of Ancestry.com. And I use that extensively in this project. In fact, some of the officers I talked, the soldiers, officers and enlisted men that I talked about here tonight, we had some documents or evidence in our collections, but I immediately went to find out whether there was a pension file on them from the Pension Act of 1818 or the Pension Act of 1832. And if there was, you really struck gold. Now, I want to offer one little codicil to that, because you may be thinking, well, what if my ancestor didn't seek a pension or they didn't live long enough to do so? Well, people had to explain when they sought a pension who they'd served with and under. And it's very possible that your ancestor may be mentioned in the pension application of somebody who served in the same unit. My own multiple great-grandfather, who was a North Carolina soldier of the Revolution, he was a lieutenant, and then his peers elected him to be captain during a critical moment of the Revolution. He didn't live to seek a pension, but somebody mentions this tale, how it was that they had served under him during the Revolution. And so I learned just myself about somebody from whom I'm descended from a pension application of somebody who completely different, different soldier who served in the same unit. And so you look for those too, and to find information. It is a glorious body of records. It is wildly underused. It's the best way to learn about ordinary people who fought in the American Revolution. You got to recognize, though, these are documents that were prepared decades after the war. So people's memories fade and aren't entirely reliable. At the same time, you get to learn about what had happened to them since the war from those documents. And there's no place else that you can do that in such wonderful detail.